The summer of 1945. The Iowa air was thick with the smell of sweet corn and a war that had just ended. But for 6 German women, the war followed them here, prisoners. They stepped off an army truck onto Helen Morrison's farm, their faces hard, expecting a monster. Instead, they got a quiet widow who grilled them corn for lunch. The women laughed. "That's animal food," one of them sneered. But Helen didn't say a word. She just left them a plate, hot and buttered. They were prepared for a jailer. They got a meal instead. And in that one taste, the entire war between them began to unravel. If you believe small acts of kindness can change history, hit that subscribe button to hear more incredible true stories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's fascinating to see how far these stories travel. The army truck kicked up a cloud of ochre dust as it rattled away down the long gravel drive, its engine noise swallowed by the immense humming silence of the Iowa fields. 6 German women stood in a tight defensive cluster, marooned in a sea of green corn that stretched to a horizon shimmering with heat. This was their prison now. No wire, no walls, just an endless sky and the steady, watchful gaze of a woman they had been taught to hate. Helen Morrison did not look like the monsters from the posters. She was a plain-faced woman in a faded floral dress, her hands sturdy and chapped from work, her expression as unreadable as the flat land around them. She gestured toward a stack of empty crates by the barn, her voice even and low. "We'll start by sorting the apples from the cellar, good ones for canning, bruised for sauce." She spoke without anger, but also without warmth. It was the voice of a person giving an order, plain and simple. Annalisa Hahn watched her, her posture rigid, her eyes narrowed. She had been a school teacher in Dresden, a place of books and stone and history. Here, the only architecture was the vast, vertical green of the corn stalks, rustling in a wind that carried no secrets. Annalise had built a fortress inside herself, brick by painful brick. And this American woman's quiet efficiency was just another wall to observe, to understand, to defeat. She would not be broken by farm work. She would not be broken by kindness, which was surely the most deceptive weapon of all. They worked through the morning, the unfamiliar scent of damp earth and rotting apples filling the cool air of the cellar. The silence between them and Helen was thick and heavy, broken only by the soft thud of apples being sorted into piles. The American woman worked alongside them, her movements economical and sure, never wasting a single motion. She did not shout, did not threaten. It was unsettling. Propaganda had promised them beasts, loud and cruel. This quiet competence felt more dangerous somehow. It gave them nothing to fight against. When the sun was high and hot, burning directly overhead, Helen left. The cellar. The women exchanged nervous glances. Was this it? The moment the mask would drop? They followed her out into the blinding light and saw she had built a small fire in a pit near the farmhouse. A plume of wood smoke curled lazily into the blue sky. On a makeshift grill over the flames, she laid a dozen ears of freshly picked corn, their yellow kernels glistening. The smell that rose from the fire was sweet, smoky, and utterly foreign. The women watched from the shade of the barn, a safe distance away. Annalisa felt a knot of contempt tighten in her stomach. She saw the younger ones, like Ilse, watching with a flicker of curiosity, of hunger. They were weak. They had forgotten who they were, who this woman was. "What is she making?" Ilse whispered, her stomach rumbling. Annalise answered loud enough for all of them to hear, her voice sharp with scorn, laced with the German word that felt like a shield. "Tierfutter. It is animal food." She said it with the authority of a teacher correcting a stupid child. She wanted the American to hear it, to know that they were not impressed, not grateful. They were prisoners, not pets to be fattened. A few of the other women murmured in agreement, their faces hardening again, their loyalty swinging back to Annalise's certainty. Helen gave no sign that she'd heard. She simply turned the cobs with a long fork, letting them char slightly, the kernels popping and hissing. When they were done, she carried them to a large enamel plate, slathered them with a thick pat of butter that melted into a golden river, and sprinkled them with salt. She didn't bring the plate to them. She didn't command them to eat. She walked over to the wooden bench beside the shed where they stood, set the heavy plate down, and then turned and walked back to her house without a single word. The screen door creaked shut behind her, leaving them alone with the offering. The smell was overwhelming. For long minutes, no one moved. It was a test. It had to be. But the youngest, Ilse, couldn't resist. She was 19, and her hunger was a fierce, simple thing that cared nothing for pride or politics. She darted forward, snatched an ear of corn, and scurried back to the group, holding it like a stolen treasure. The others watched her, holding their breath. Ilse took a hesitant bite. Her eyes widened. A small, involuntary sound of pleasure escaped her lips. The corn was smoky, impossibly sweet, the kernels bursting with a warmth that felt like pure sunshine. It wasn't animal food. It was a feast. One by one, the other women broke. They crept forward, taking a piece, their movements still cautious, almost ashamed. Soon they were all eating, the only sound the frantic, hungry gnawing of teeth on cob. Only Anneliese remained, her arms crossed, her pride a cold stone in her gut. But the sight of the others, their faces smeared with butter, their eyes closed in simple, animal bliss, chipped away at her resolve. Her own stomach ached with a hollow emptiness. Slowly, resentfully, she walked to the bench and took the last ear of corn. It was still warm in her hands. She raised it to her lips and took a bite. The sweetness that exploded in her mouth was a shock. It was a contradiction to everything she believed. It was the taste of a lie, not the one on the plate, but the one she had been feeding herself for years. She stood there, staring at the half-eaten cob in her hand, as if it held the answer to a question she was too afraid to ask. That evening, as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, Anneliese saw Helen walking through the tall grass behind the barn. She moved with a slow, deliberate pace, carrying a small jar of wildflowers. Anneliese watched from the shadows as the American woman stopped at a small, simple wooden cross hammered into the earth. It was a grave. Helen knelt, cleared a few weeds from its base, and set down the flowers. She stayed there for a long time, a solitary figure silhouetted against the dying light, her shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it needed no sound. Anneliese felt the fortress inside her begin to crumble. This woman wasn't a monster. She wasn't a jailer. She was a mother. And in that silent, shared space of loss, something between them had already begun to change. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm, dictated not by guard schedules and whistles, but by the rising and setting of the sun. The work was hard and steady, a constant loop of gathering eggs from the henhouse, their shells still warm, peeling endless buckets of apples, their sweet tart scent clinging to the air, and mending heavy burlap grain sacks, the rough fibers pricking their fingers. There were no guards posted at the edge of the fields. There was no one but Helen and her old lumbering farm dog, Luther, whose only interest in the prisoners was a friendly sniff and a hopeful gaze for a fallen scrap of food. It was Ilse, the youngest, who first dared to scratch him behind the ears. The dog leaned into her touch with a contented sigh, and in that small exchange, a piece of the invisible wall between them crumbled. Helen moved among them like a ghost, a presence more felt than heard. She never raised her voice, never chided them for slowing down. Her corrections were simple demonstrations, a more efficient way to hold a paring knife, a stronger stitch for a torn sack. Her kindness was a language of action, not words. When one of the women, a frail woman from Hamburg named Liesel, was found weeping silently in the barn, Clutching a worn pocket Bible she'd found on a dusty shelf, Helen didn't ask what was wrong. She simply placed a cool glass of water on the crate beside her and walked away, granting her the dignity of grieving in private. During the hottest part of the afternoons, she would emerge from the farmhouse carrying a tray with thick slices of buttermilk pie or cool glasses of lemonade, setting them down without ceremony, and leaving them to rest in the sliver of shade cast by the great oak tree. Annalise observed it all with a hawk's vigilance, her mind a cold ledger of suspicions. She saw these gestures not as generosity, but as a calculated campaign to soften them, to make them compliant. She kept herself apart, her posture a declaration of resistance. She performed her duties with a severe, faultless precision, refusing to be drawn into the fragile camaraderie that was slowly budding among the others. She watched Ilse laugh as Luther chased a grasshopper and saw a betrayal. She heard the others begin to use a few words of English. Water. Thank you. Good. And heard the sound of surrender. She would not surrender. She would remain a soldier, even in a calico dress with apple stains on her hands. Then, one morning, as Helen was slicing windfall apples for sauce, the knife slipped. It was a stupid, simple accident. A bright line of red blossomed across her thumb, deep and clean. Blood welled up instantly, dripping onto the white flesh of the apple. Helen gasped, fumbling for a dish rag. Before she could even press it to the wound, Annalise was there. She moved with a speed and certainty that was startling. "Here," she said, her voice sharp and clinical. She took Helen's hand, her grip firm, and wrapped it tightly in a clean cloth from the pile. "Pressure, keep it elevated." Her English was perfect, stripped of any accent, the words of a textbook. She rummaged through a kitchen drawer and found Helen's small first aid box. With practiced, impersonal efficiency, she cleaned the wound with alcohol. Helen flinched but said nothing, and bandaged it tightly with gauze and tape. The entire procedure took less than a minute. Helen looked from her neatly bandaged thumb to Annalise's stony face. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. Annalise simply nodded, her eyes avoiding Helen's. She turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word, her back ramrod straight, leaving Helen alone with the sting of alcohol and the strange warmth of an enemy's care. The moment that changed everything came a few days later, on an afternoon so warm and still you could hear the corn growing. The chores were done early. The women lingered by the barn, reluctant to return to the stuffy barracks, their temporary home. From inside the farmhouse, the sound of Helen's small kitchen radio drifted out, a tinny orchestra playing a vague, sentimental melody. It was just background noise, a sound from another world. Then Liesel, the woman who had wept in the barn, began to hum. It was a simple, haunting tune, a melody stitched into the fabric of their childhoods. Ilse's head lifted, a smile touching her lips, and she joined in, her voice clear and young. "Schlaf, Kindlein, schlaf. Sleep, little child, sleep." Inside, Helen froze, her hands submerged in a basin of soapy water. She knew that song. Her own mother, whose parents had come from Germany, had sung it to her. She, in turn, had sung it to her son, Michael, every night until he was too old to allow it any more. The melody was a key, unlocking a room in her heart she had sealed shut. It was the sound of his hair under her hand, of his small body curled against hers. It was the sound of everything she had lost. The music floated across the yard, a fragile bridge connecting a farmhouse in Iowa to a lullaby from the Rhine, connecting a grieving American mother to the women who belonged to the army that had taken her son. She walked to the screen door and watched them, her heart aching with a pain that was both old and new. They had stopped humming and were just sitting, lost in the shared memory the song had conjured. The spell was broken by Ilse, who let out a little sigh of contentment and looked over at the endless rows of corn. "It is better than the rations in Metz," she declared with a grin, "the corn." A few of the others laughed, a soft, tired sound. Even Annalise, sitting on a log slightly apart from the group, didn't offer a scornful word. She just sat in the golden light of the late afternoon, her face turned toward the setting sun, her expression unreadable. For a single, breathless moment, there were no prisoners and no widow. There were only women, resting at the end of a long day, surrounded by a strange, unasked-for peace. 2 days passed in that strange, suspended peace. The air itself felt softer, the work less like a sentence and more like a shared purpose. Helen found herself watching them, not as prisoners, but as individuals. She learned Liesel moved with the slow grace of a dancer, even when weeding the garden. She noticed Ilse had a habit of tucking a wildflower behind her ear when she thought no one was looking. They had even begun to help in the kitchen, their presence filling the lonely space with the low murmur of German and the comforting sounds of chopping and stirring. This afternoon, they were kneading bread. Helen worked a large ball of dough on the floured countertop, while another woman, Greta, worked beside her, her movements hesitant at first, then gaining confidence. Out on the porch, Ilse was sitting on the steps, gently stroking Luther's head as he dozed with a happy sigh, his big body leaning against her legs. The scene was one of quiet domesticity, so normal it was almost breathtaking. The spell was shattered by the sound of an engine, louder and more aggressive than the army truck had been. A dusty Ford pickup barreled down the driveway and skidded to a stop. George Lantham, her late husband's brother, swung himself out of the driver's seat. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, from his rigid posture to his sharp jaw. A veteran of the First War who had buried a son in the Second, George saw the world in black and white, us and them, right and wrong. And what he saw in Helen's yard was unequivocally wrong. His eyes, narrowed against the sun, swept over the scene, the German girl petting the dog, another in Helen's kitchen, the rest resting in the shade as if they were hired help on a Sunday picnic. His face tightened into a mask of grim disapproval. He strode toward the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Helen," he said. It wasn't a greeting, it was an indictment. "What is this?" Helen wiped her hands on her apron, her heart sinking. "George, they're helping with the bread." "Helping?" He gestured with a sharp nod toward Ilse, who had shrunk away from his gaze, her hand frozen on Luther's back. "Looks to me like you're running a social club for the Wehrmacht." His voice was low, but it carried the force of a public accusation. He looked past Helen, through the screen door, his eyes locking on Greta standing frozen by the counter. He saw the enemy in Helen's kitchen. He saw a desecration. He did not speak to them, did not even acknowledge them as human. He just stared, his contempt a palpable force. He turned back to Helen. "They took my boy, Helen. They took yours. Don't you ever forget that." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned on his heel, climbed back into his truck, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, poisonous silence in his wake. The call came that evening. The next day an officer arrived in a jeep holding a clipboard and an official-looking envelope. He spoke in the clipped, impersonal tones of bureaucracy. There had been a report, a complaint filed with the provost marshal's office, concerns about fraternization. He read from the paper. Pursuant to regulations regarding the welfare and security of Axis prisoners, the labor detail assigned to this location will be relocated to the central camp at Algona within 24 hours. A small 2-sentence article had already appeared in the local paper, a vague but damning piece about the soft treatment of German prisoners on a local farm. "You can't," Helen said, her voice small but fierce. "They're just women. They're good workers." The officer's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, the decision has been made. It's a matter of policy." He was not a cruel man. He was simply a cog in a machine that had no room for sentiment. Her words were just wind against a stone wall. He gave her the details for their departure the following morning and left. That night Helen made them one last supper. She roasted a chicken and potatoes, the familiar, comforting smells, filling a kitchen now thick with sorrow. They ate in absolute silence. No one made jokes. No one looked up from their plates. The food, which had once been a bridge, was now just something to get through. Every bite felt heavy, like swallowing stones. The quiet peace they had built together had been a temporary illusion, a house of cards blown down by a single gust of anger. As the women filed out to the barracks for the last time, their shoulders slumped in defeat, Ilse hung back. She quickly placed a small, folded piece of paper on the kitchen table before hurrying out the door. Helen picked it up. On it, in neat, careful script, were a few simple words. "You treated us like people. That was not what we were told you would be." Helen's throat tightened, and she squeezed the note in her hand. She was clearing the last of the plates when the screen door creaked open again. It was Annalisa, standing in the doorway like a specter. She walked to the table and set something small and metallic on the polished wood. It was her Red Cross identification tag. Helen looked at her, confused. Annalisa's face was pale in the dim light. Her composure finally cracked, revealing the raw grief beneath. "On the back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Helen turned the tag over. Faintly scratched into the metal was a name, Annalisa Hahn, her real name, an offering of profound trust. Annalisa looked at Helen, her eyes holding a terrible, ancient sadness. "I saw your son in Normandy," she said, the words falling into the silent room like stones into a deep well. "He could have killed me. He didn't." She turned and was gone before Helen could find her voice, before she could ask, before she could even breathe. She was left alone in the quiet kitchen, holding a paper note in one hand and a stranger's name in the other, the entire war suddenly collapsing into one impossible, devastating, and merciful moment. The winter that followed was long and hard, a season of biting winds that scoured the flat land and snow that buried the fields in a silent white grief. Helen moved through the days in a familiar solitude, the farmhouse once again too quiet, too large. The ghosts of her husband and son had been joined by 6 more, the ghosts of women she had known for only a few weeks. Sometimes, in the quiet of the kitchen, she thought she could hear the echo of their German murmurs or catch the scent of baking bread that wasn't there. She kept Ilse's note and Annalisa's dog tag in a small wooden box on her mantelpiece, next to a faded photograph of Michael in his uniform. They were relics of a peace that had been as brief and beautiful as an Iowa summer. Spring arrived slowly, tentatively, in trickles of melting snow and the hesitant chirping of sparrows. The earth softened, turning the color of rich, dark chocolate. Life was returning to the land. It was on one such morning, when the air finally carried the scent of thawing soil instead of ice, that the letter came. It was in a thin, fragile envelope, the paper almost translucent, covered in unfamiliar stamps. The return address was just a street and a number in a place called Berlin. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The handwriting was precise, elegant, the ink faded but the letters firm. It was from Annalisa. She was alive. She was home, or what was left of it. She wrote of the ruins, of the hunger, of the staggering task of rebuilding a city and a life from rubble. She was teaching again in a makeshift school held in the basement of a bombed-out church. She also ran a small soup kitchen, she wrote, for the countless war widows and orphans who roamed the city like lost souls. Then Helen's eyes fell upon a line that made her stop breathing. In a small plot of cleared land behind the church, amidst the debris, she had planted a garden. "I am growing corn," Annalise wrote, "American style, sweet like mercy." Tucked inside the envelope was a photograph, its edges curled from the long journey. Helen slid it out. 5 women stood together, squinting in a watery sun, their faces thin but their eyes clear. They stood in front of a fledgling garden, a small patch of defiant green in a landscape of gray devastation. It was them, Ilse, Liesel, Greta. Annalisa stood slightly to the side, her arm around Ilse's shoulder, a ghost of a smile on her lips. Taped carefully to the back of the photograph was a single, dried corn husk, folded neatly like a bookmark, a fragile reminder of a shared meal in another world. That afternoon, Helen walked out to the small wooden cross behind the barn. The wildflowers from last summer were long gone, but the first green shoots of spring were pushing their way up through the cold earth. She knelt and propped the photograph against the base of the cross, right next to the formal army portrait of Michael she kept in the house. She looked at her son's handsome, smiling face, frozen forever at age 20. Then she looked at the faces of the 5 women who had survived. Annalise's final words to her echoed in the quiet air. "He could have killed me. He didn't." Michael had shown mercy in the heart of the war. She had simply finished the job. She whispered the words to the wind, a prayer to a son who couldn't hear her. He didn't come home, but this is something he'd be proud of. A sense of peace settled over her, not erasing the grief, but making it part of a larger story, one that didn't end in a field in Normandy. Years passed. The world healed its deepest wounds, and the farm continued its steady cycle of planting and harvest. Helen grew older, her hair turning the color of milkweed silk, her movements slower but just as sure. One hot summer afternoon, she stood by a familiar fire pit behind the house. Beside her, her granddaughter Sarah, a girl of 8 with bright, curious eyes, watched intently. "You have to keep turning it, Grandma, right?" the girl asked, her small hands gripping the handle of a long fork. Helen smiled, her face crinkling at the corners. "That's right. So it gets a little charred, but not burnt. That's the secret." She guided Sarah's hand, helping her turn an ear of corn that was sizzling over the flames, the kernels popping and releasing a sweet, smoky perfume into the air. When it was done, she helped her granddaughter carry it to a platter, slather it with butter, and sprinkle it with salt, the same simple ritual she had performed for another group of women so long ago. Sarah took a big, happy bite, butter dripping down. Her chin. "It's the best, Grandma," she said through a full mouth. Helen just watched her, her heart full. The war was over. The hate was over. But the corn remained. The simple, nourishing, and unexpected sweetness of it. It was a harvest of peace, planted in a moment of kindness that would continue to feed her family for generations to come. It was the taste of mercy.